And so our final video for this week, and your second piece of work, which will be due to be emailed on Wednesday next week, is evaluate the extent to which the nature of parliamentary sovereignty has changed in the UK in recent years. So this question is linked to the idea somehow that sovereignty has been somehow draining away from Parliament to other actors and institutions in the political system. That although we have this concept of parliamentary sovereignty, it has certainly weakened in recent years. And in recent years, I'm maybe talking back to the 70s, although this can go back much further. So, where should we start with how sovereignty has somehow started to drain away from Parliament? Well, one of the most obvious places where parliamentary sovereignty has drained away, and if you're talking about Parliament, we're talking about the floor of the Commons and to an extent the floor of the House of Lords, this idea that Parliament is sovereign. Well, the first place that sovereignty would have drained away to would be to the executive. And this is what you're studying with Miss Brown. And it's not a new concept. I mean, we looked at Bagshot's English Constitution written back in 1867, and Bagshot said that Parliament itself was simply becoming one of the dignified parts of our Constitution because power had, he didn't use the phrase, it had drained away upwards, if that's not defying gravity, towards the cabinet, because for the emergence of disciplined political parties, whoever controlled the largest party in the Commons could therefore control the floor of the Commons, so therefore it was the cabinet that was the really efficient body in the British system, and Parliament, like the monarch itself, was on the way to becoming a dignified. And that trend has continued in the last 150 years. So the first place where parliamentary sovereignty has been eroded or drained away is upwards towards the executive, the cabinet, and then with Miss Brown, has it gone up even further to the Prime Minister? Do we have prime ministerial government or the more presidential system? So that's the first place where you could argue power has drained away from Parliament. Second place, and you notice the cutting edge graphic as each one of them goes through, Parliament picture tends to shrink a little bit. The second place where parliamentary sovereignty certainly drained away was to the institutions of the EU. A fairly continuous process since we joined in 73. We looked at the Factor Tame case where EU laws take precedence over UK laws in the areas that we've given up sovereignty. I know there was an argument we had pooled sovereignty rather than given up. But that's an area where we had certainly given up sovereignty. Of course, now we've had Brexit, so this picture would diminish somewhat, but the picture post-Brexit still isn't clear. Will we still have some areas that might be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice? But certainly the EU was one of the places where parliamentary sovereignty had significantly drained away or been eroded in recent years, although that picture is ongoing. Third place, clearly degree of sovereignty was drained away to the devolved institutions. All those policy areas where policies for the devolved institutions, I mean Scotland in particular, policy for those is decided in the Scottish Parliament. The Parliament doesn't have a say on those particular areas. And according to the Sewell Convention, the UK Parliament doesn't even discuss those devolved issues unless it's got agreement by the devolved Parliament. So devolution is one of those areas that's seen parliamentary sovereignty drain away. Thirdly, use of referendums. This idea of popular sovereignty, that yes, we know referendums aren't binding, but it's very difficult for a government to go against the outcome of a referendum. So therefore, referendums have contributed to this shrinking or diminution of parliamentary sovereignty. And then finally, the Supreme Court, judiciary, essentially our Supreme Court, that's particularly with the introduction of the Human Rights Act, and its ability to, or the requirement of Parliament, all parliamentary acts to be in line with the Human Rights Act, and then the Supreme Court is the arbiter of whether acts of Parliament are compatible with the Human Rights Act. That in effect means that Parliament, combined with the fact that all acts have to be compatible with the Human Rights Act, that Parliament has lost some sovereignty and power to the judiciary and the Supreme Court. So they're the main areas that you would argue that parliamentary sovereignty has been eroded, or sovereignty or power has drained away from Parliament to other actors. Another way to explain that, I know there's some football fans among you, so if there isn't, you'll have to bear with me. But I know if you've been to a football game and say one of the opposing players is not quite at a peak level of fitness, shall we say, is a bit out of shape, and the opposing fans have a cruel song that they sing, "Who's eating all the pies?" So imagine sovereignty is a pie, or in this case a pizza. So who's eating all the sovereignty pizza, or some of it? So these are slices of sovereignty pizza here. Well, oops, wrong one to start with. Should we start with this one? Okay, so one slice of sovereignty pizza has gone to the EU, as we just talked about it. Another slice has gone to devolution. Another slice has gone to the judiciary. Another slice has gone to the executive. And another slice has gone to referendums. So the overall aspect of sovereignty has been reduced, has been eaten by these other institutions. If that's an easier way to remember it, who's eaten all the sovereignty pizza. But of course, it's never as clear-cut as that. What's the counter-arguments? So is Parliament still relevant? Evaluate the extent to which Parliament is still relevant in the political system, or the essay you're going to do, evaluate the extent to which the nature of parliamentary sovereignty has changed in recent years. Well, there is no simple yes or no answer, a good Irish answer. It's yes and no. So if we go back again to our pizza, just to start off with, well, in terms of the EU, well, clearly Parliament always retained legal sovereignty, and we have exercised that with Brexit, although again it's still not 100% clear. In terms of devolution, Parliament did not devolve sovereignty, it only devolved powers to the region. So we have a quasi-federal system, not a completely federal system where powers are shared. So again, Parliament retains legal sovereignty and could take it back if needed. And while that may seem unthinkable, Brexit was unthinkable a couple of decades ago, and look where we are now. Judiciary, Parliament retains legal sovereignty. The Human Rights Act is uncodified and unentrenched, and the Supreme Court can only issue a declaration of incompatibility, which Parliament has its own ways to get around. In terms of the executive, we looked at that essay, to what extent can Parliament control the executive? Well, clearly it can. Parliament can exert sovereignty, ultimately a vote of no confidence, but it's also got the other processes, debates, questions to ministers, committee systems and voting, and then we looked at the little sort of pinprick ones, the early day motions, the adjournment debates and opposition days. But Parliament has these processes that if it wants to exercise its sovereignty over the executive, it can. And then finally we've got referendums, which for some reason I can't do that, so I can get rid of that. Escape will do it for me. Okay, so if I put referendums, clearly referendums are not binding. They're called by the government, they're controlled by the government, and I'm not sure how many more we'll see after Brexit. So that leads us into your essay plan, if you like, which is this one here. And again, I've uploaded this sheet on to show my homework to summarise the arguments. So your AL1 will be what is parliamentary sovereignty, that you know some idea of what it is. And then do you say to a large extent parliamentary sovereignty has changed in terms of diminished or eroded, or to a lesser extent to some degree? Well, strong argument internally, the power of the executive has grown. We talked about the dominance of the majority party, the elective dictatorship, the power of the whips, etc. And we also looked at how the power of Parliament, scrutiny, accountability, controlling is very weak because of party loyalty, party discipline, and the power of patronage an MP has. However, and again, of course, you're into your counter-argument, or if you want to start with this one, that's your counter-argument. Parliament can still curb the power of the executive, control the executive, re-exert sovereignty if it wishes through those tools we looked at, committees and voting. Parliament as a whole is the institution that has legitimacy. All bills have to pass through Parliament, and Parliament can block or vote down legislation or force compromise. And a broader point, executive power is not fixed. It depends on other factors, and you should cover this with Miss Brown. Size of the government's majority, a lack of majority, the popularity of the Prime Minister. This idea that power ebbs and flows, with some Prime Ministers and executives can appear very powerful, and then power ebbs away. Blair post-Iraq, Miss Thatcher post-87, while some are just naturally very weak anyway, so you can't generalise about it. Major, Brown and May. So that would be your counter-arguments. Moving on internally, the creation of the devolved institutions, which you've just talked about. But however, don't forget we've a quasi-federal system. Parliament has devolved powers, not sovereignty. And while this may seem an irreversible change, 20 years ago Brexit would have been seen as irreversible, and that's no longer the case. Parliament has lost only the Human Rights Act. All acts have to comply with it. Final decisions on the European Convention rest with the European Court of Human Rights. However, the Human Rights Act is not applied to Parliament itself. Supreme Court declarations can be either ignored or overwritten with new legislation. And if you think of that one we looked at about closed material procedures as a good example, where Parliament found that they were unconstitutional, they contravened common law, and Parliament simply passed a new piece of legislation to override that. And the HRA is not deeply entrenched compared to some other aspects of the constitutional reforms we'd have. If Cameron had won a significant majority in 2015, and if the Brexit referendum hadn't intervened, it's quite possible you could have ended up with a British Bill of Rights, or at least the start of the discussion. The use of referendums and this idea of popular sovereignty. However, referendums are still advisory, they're called by the government, and we may not have many more after what happened with Brexit. And then externally, power is drained away to the European Union. Yes, we are going through Brexit, but even now, Parliament may have to compromise on sovereignty post-Brexit to achieve this trade deal, may have to compromise on the movement of people or trading standards, or maybe the European Court of Justice will still have some say in our internal affairs. However, Brexit itself is a clear example for how Parliament has always retained legal sovereignty, which was the original judgment of the judges in Factor Tame. Yes, EU law has precedence over UK law. In those areas it's given up sovereignty, but UK can ultimately decide to come out of the EU, which at the time seemed a bit daft, but that's what's happened. So again, it's a clear example of the UK retaining legal sovereignty. So broadly speaking, while Parliament has lost a degree of political sovereignty, it still retains legal sovereignty and can vote to reverse those decisions as well. So this sheet here, again it's uploaded to show my homework, would be your essay plan for that second essay, which is due on Wednesday. Evaluate the extent to which the nature of parliamentary sovereignty has changed in recent years. As always, if there's anything you're not sure about, just send me an email and I will pick it up. Okay, happy studying Year 12 and speak to you next week.